When the grid died, mercy died with it. People prayed for the government to save them, but my family just kept moving. Right now, the smell of burning pine and cordite fills my lungs. Hunting dogs bark in the freezing darkness. The heavy steel of my pistol grip bites into my cold hand. You adapt to the cold, or you become a corpse. My name is Vance Sterling. I have 300 miles of hell to cross, and I will kill anyone who touches my family. This is Solar Flare Exodus. Chapter 1. The Grid Falls. The heater in the old Ford F-150 pushed warm air against the bitter Denver cold. Vance Sterling kept his eyes on the bumper of the gray sedan in front of him. Traffic on Interstate 25 was a crawling river of steel and exhaust. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Normal. Frustrating. Boring. Vance gripped the worn leather steering wheel. He hated the city. He hated the fragile, invisible grid that kept millions of people alive. A harsh light flooded the cabin. It was not a reflection. It was not a glare from a passing windshield. The sky above the Rocky Mountains ignited. A blinding wave of brilliant white washed over the world. It burned right through the heavy winter clouds. Vance squinted hard. He raised a gloved hand to shield his eyes from the impossible brightness. Then the truck died. The engine sputtered once, coughed a puff of black exhaust, and fell completely silent. The heater fan spun down to nothing. The radio cut out in the middle of a word. The green dashboard lights vanished. The steady, vibrating hum of the highway ceased. It happened in a fraction of a second. Thousands of combustion engines died simultaneously. Vance stomped his heavy boot on the brake pedal. It was stiff as a brick. The power assist was gone. He wrestled the heavy steering wheel to the right, feeling the sheer dead weight of the mechanical linkage. The truck drifted toward the snowy shoulder. He ground the tires against the concrete retaining barrier to force a halt. All around him, the interstate descended into absolute chaos. Modern cars with electronic steering and braking systems became unguided missiles of glass and steel. Momentum carried them forward, but their drivers had no control. The sedan in front of Vance slammed directly into the rear of a stalled delivery van. Metal crumpled like cheap aluminum foil. Safety glass exploded across the asphalt in a glittering wave. A heavy SUV swerved into the next lane, caught a tire, rolled onto its side, and skidded 40 yards in a deafening shower of orange sparks. The sound of tearing steel echoed off the concrete walls. Screams followed immediately. Then came the realization that froze the blood in his veins. There were no horns. In a massive traffic pileup, car horns always blared in a continuous, agonizing wail. Now, there was only the sound of human panic and the hiss of leaking radiators. The electrical systems were entirely fried. The silence beneath the screaming was wrong. It was dead. Vance reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out his smartphone. The screen was black. He pressed the power button. Nothing. He held it down for 10 seconds. It was a cold, useless brick of glass. He checked his digital watch. Blank. He looked up through the windshield. A massive shadow passed rapidly over the highway. A commercial airliner had just taken off from Denver International Airport. It was banking west over the city. Now it was falling out of the sky. The massive jet engines were dead silent. The nose dipped steeply. The plane dropped like a stone, its white fuselage standing out against the gray clouds. It disappeared behind the downtown skyline. 3 seconds later, the ground shook violently. A concussive shockwave rattled the windows of the Ford. A thick, oily plume of black smoke billowed up into the winter sky. Vance knew exactly what had just happened. He had spent years studying it. He had prepared his family for it, much to their annoyance. A coronal mass ejection. An extreme X-class solar flare hitting the planet head-on. Or perhaps it was an electromagnetic pulse from a high-altitude detonation. It did not matter. The result was exactly the same. The power grid was gone. Every microchip, every transformer, every piece of modern infrastructure in the hemisphere was baked. The world had just been thrown back to the dark ages in the blink of an eye. Vance did not wait for the police. The police were not coming. Their radios were dead. Their dispatch centers were blind. He threw open the heavy door of the truck. The freezing air bit into his face. He reached behind the worn passenger seat and dragged out his get-home bag. It was a dark gray canvas backpack. It looked like gym gear, nothing tactical, nothing that screamed he had survival supplies. He threw it over his shoulder. The weight of the water filtration kit, the emergency rations, the paracord, and the trauma kit settled reassuringly against his spine. He popped the center console. He drew his Glock 19. He dropped the magazine, checked the brass casings of the 9mm hollow points, and slapped it back in. He racked the slide. He slid the weapon into the concealed holster inside his waistband. He pulled his heavy winter coat down to cover the grip. The highway was a graveyard of modern engineering. People were staggering out of their vehicles in a daze. A man in a tailored business suit was holding his phone up to the sky, shaking it frantically, shouting at the blank screen. A woman was trying to pry open the crushed sliding door of a minivan. Blood poured from a cut on her forehead. Vance felt his stomach twist into a hard knot. A part of him, the old civil engineer who built bridges and roads, wanted to stay. He wanted to organize a triage center. He wanted to help pull the bleeding injured from the smoking wreckage. But the father in him took total control. Corinne was at home. Declan and Maeve were at home. Home was 7 miles away through a major city that was about to eat itself alive. He climbed over the concrete barrier and slid down the steep, snowy embankment. He hit the surface street below with a heavy thud. Denver was paralyzed. The traffic lights were dark, empty boxes swinging in the wind. The shops along the avenue were pitched in blackness. The quiet was unnatural and heavy. Without the low, constant background hum of electricity, the city felt like a massive tomb waiting to be sealed. Vance started jogging. He kept a steady, measured pace. He needed to conserve his energy and his oxygen. He stuck to the alleys and the snowy sidewalks. He actively avoided the main intersections where the traffic collisions were piling up and the crowds were gathering. Within the first mile, the initial confusion began to curdle into primal anger. Vance passed a large corner pharmacy. A crowd of 30 people was gathered at the locked automatic glass doors. The electronic security locks had failed in the closed position. A large man wearing a heavy work jacket was smashing the glass with a heavy steel tire iron. "Get back," the man shouted at the desperate people pressing in behind him. "My kids need their medicine." The safety glass finally shattered, raining down on the pavement. The crowd surged forward like a pack of starving wolves. They poured into the dark store, stepping over the broken glass. Fights broke out instantly in the aisles. Vance heard the sickening thud of a heavy fist hitting bone, followed by a woman screaming for help. He kept moving. He forced himself not to look back. The thin veneer of civilization was peeling away faster than he had ever imagined. The cold truth settled deep into his chest. There would be no government emergency response. The water pumping stations would stop flowing by tomorrow. The grocery store shelves would be stripped bare by nightfall. The freezing mountain temperatures would do the rest of the killing. He picked up his pace. His breath plumed in the freezing air in short, rhythmic bursts. His lungs burned from the cold. 7 miles was a very long way on foot, especially in winter boots. He crossed a wide residential street lined with apartment complexes. A man was pulling a heavy red generator out of his open garage. 2 younger men were walking purposefully toward him from the sidewalk. They were not talking. They had heavy steel pipe wrenches gripped tightly in their hands. Their eyes were fixed on the generator. Vance crossed to the other side of the street. He ducked behind a long row of tall evergreen hedges. He heard angry shouting. He heard a wet, heavy crunch. A body hit the driveway. Vance kept his eyes fixed forward. He tightened his grip on the straps of his backpack. Stay off the radar, stay invisible. Do not become a target. Mile after mile, the city unraveled around him. Fires began to burn in the distance. Without fire trucks or water pressure to respond, small blazes from ruptured gas tanks spread quickly to nearby commercial structures. The acrid smell of burning rubber, melted plastic, and scorched wood filled the thin air. Thick gray smoke drifted down the streets, stinging his eyes and coating the back of his throat. His leg muscles ached. His boots pounded against the frozen pavement. He checked his mechanical wristwatch again. 2 hours had passed since the sky flashed white. The winter sun was beginning to dip lower behind the mountains. The temperature was dropping fast, easily pushing below freezing. Tonight would be brutal. The people trapped in the city would freeze to death in their unheated homes and stalled cars. He finally recognized the familiar streets of his own suburban neighborhood. The houses here were older, built far apart with large oak trees lining the sidewalks. Usually, it was a quiet place. Usually, children were riding bikes or playing in the front yards. Now, black smoke billowed from a 2-story house just 3 blocks down the road. Vance slowed his pace to a cautious walk. He needed to assess his own street before stepping out into the open. He rounded the final corner, keeping close to the brick wall of a corner house. His chest heaved. Cold sweat soaked his thermal base layer despite the freezing wind. Chaos had already reached his doorstep. 50 yards down the street, two neighbors were wrestling violently over a plastic gasoline can on a snowy lawn. One of them threw a wild, desperate punch. The other tackled him hard into the snow, hands reaching for his throat. Directly across the street, a family was hurriedly throwing loose clothing and canned food into an SUV that would never start again. They were screaming at each other, totally blind to the reality of their dead vehicle. Panic made people stupid. Vance focused his eyes on his own house, a two-story brick colonial sitting quietly at the very end of the cul-de-sac. The heavy oak front door was wide open. His heart stopped. The blood drained completely from his face. He broke his dead, reckless sprint. He ignored the burning fire in his lungs and the exhaustion in his legs. He reached under his coat and gripped the handle of his pistol. His thumb flicked the safety off. He vaulted over the low wooden fence in his front yard. His boots slipped on the icy grass, but he caught his balance. He scrambled up the front porch steps, ready to kill whoever was inside. He stopped dead in his tracks. Corinne stood in the doorway. She was not wearing her usual comfortable sweater. She wore her heavy canvas hunting coat and thick leather gloves. Her face was pale, but her jaw was set like carved stone. Her eyes were sharp, calculating, and completely devoid of panic. They locked onto Vance the second his boot hit the wooden porch. In her hands, she held his Remington 12-gauge pump-action shotgun. The safety was disengaged. Her index finger rested just outside the trigger guard, demonstrating perfect trigger discipline. She looked past him at the street. She watched the neighbors beating each other bloody on the lawn. She watched the dark smoke rising into the darkening sky. She stepped back into the shadows of the hallway and lowered the heavy barrel of the shotgun just an inch. "We need to leave," Corinne said. "Now." Chapter 2. The Bug Out. Corinne lowered the heavy barrel of the shotgun. Vance stepped through the doorway. His chest heaved with every breath. Cold winter air rushed into the hallway behind him. He closed the heavy oak door and threw the deadbolt. "We have 15 minutes, Vance said. His voice was completely flat. The city is already tearing itself apart. The grid is gone. Everything electronic is dead. Corinne did not ask questions. She did not panic. She had spent the last 5 years listening to Vance talk about this exact scenario. She used to call him paranoid. She used to roll her eyes when he rotated the canned goods in the basement and filled plastic barrels with purified water. Now, the cold reality of his warnings settled into her bones. The world they knew had ended 10 minutes ago. "The survival bags are packed," Corinne replied. She clicked the safety back onto the shotgun. "I will get the kids." She moved past him toward the stairs. The house felt entirely different. The low, constant hum of modern life was missing. The refrigerator motor was silent. The air conditioning unit was dead. The digital clocks on the microwave and oven were blank screens. The silence was heavy and suffocating. Corinne walked into the guest bedroom first. She opened the large wooden medical cabinet. As a former emergency medical technician, she knew what would kill them first. It would not be bullets. It would be infection, dehydration, and exposure. She loaded quick clot bandages, tourniquets, broad-spectrum antibiotics, and water purification tablets into a heavy nylon pouch. She shoved the pouch into her dark green canvas backpack. She hurried down the hallway to Declan. The door to his room was wide open. Her 17-year-old son sat on the edge of his unmade bed. He was staring at the black screen of his smartphone. His thumb swiped frantically across the glass over and over again. His expensive gaming computer sat uselessly on the desk. The cooling fans were silent. The neon lights were dark. "Declan," Corinne said sharply, "get your coat, get your boots." He looked up. His face was pale. His eyes were wide with total disbelief. "Mom, the internet is down. The cellular network is down. Even my battery backup brick is dead. Nothing is turning on." "Put your boots on right now," Corinne ordered. She stepped into the room and grabbed his heavy winter jacket from the closet. She threw it onto his lap. "I need to text Sarah," Declan said. His voice was rising in pitch. Panic was setting in. "She went to the mall with her friends. I have to call her." Corinne grabbed his shoulders. Her grip was hard enough to bruise. She forced him to look directly into her eyes. "Declan, listen to me very carefully. The phones are never coming back on. We are leaving the city. Grab your survival pack from the closet. Walk downstairs. Do not make me ask you again." He blinked. The harsh tone of her voice finally broke through his shock. He dropped the useless phone onto the carpet. He stood up slowly, his hands trembling as he reached for his jacket. Corinne left him and walked into the next room. Maeve was already standing in the middle of her bedroom. Her 10-year-old daughter wore her thick winter coat, a wool beanie, and insulated gloves. Her small purple backpack was strapped tightly to her shoulders. She held a worn, stuffed bear in her left hand and an aluminum water bottle in her right. Her face was perfectly calm. She had always been observant. She had seen her father running toward the house. She knew what to do. "Good girl," Corinne said softly. Her heart ached for a moment. Children should not have to be this prepared for the end of the world. "Let us go down to the garage." Vance was already in the garage. The automatic door opener was useless without electricity. He had pulled the red emergency release cord and manually heaved the heavy metal door upward. Brutal, freezing wind blew inside, carrying the faint smell of burning plastic from the streets. Sitting in the center of the concrete floor was the 1989 Jeep Wrangler. It was boxy, painted a faded olive green, and smelled like old motor oil and dust. Vance had purchased it 3 years ago specifically for this day. He insisted they needed a vehicle with a carburetor, a mechanical fuel pump, and absolutely zero computer chips. It was immune to the electromagnetic pulse that had just fried the modern world. Vance threw his heavy gray canvas bag into the back seat. Declan stumbled out of the house behind Corinne and Maeve. He threw his bag in and climbed into the back, staring blankly at the floorboards. A sudden voice echoed from the driveway. "Corinne, Vance, please." Corinne turned sharply. She tightened her grip on the shotgun. It was Greg. He lived 3 houses down. He was standing at the edge of their driveway. He wore only a thin indoor sweater and jeans. The biting wind made his whole body shiver violently. He looked terrified. "Greg, stay back," Vance said. He placed his right hand firmly on the grip of his concealed pistol. "My wife," Greg said. His voice broke into a desperate sob. "Her insulin was in the refrigerator. It needs to stay cold, and she needs her heart medication. The pharmacy on the corner is completely destroyed. People are beating each other to death in the aisles. Do you have a generator? Do you have any medicine? Please, just a little bit." Corinne felt a tight, agonizing knot form in her throat. The medical oath she took years ago screamed at her to help. Her instinct was to run to her neighbor. She knew the pain his wife was going to suffer. She looked at Greg. Then she looked at Maeve, sitting quietly in the back of the cold Jeep. There was a finite amount of medicine in her bag. There was no hospital to resupply from. If Maeve got sick, or if Vance took a bullet, those pills were the only thing standing between her family and death. "We have nothing, Greg," Corinne said. Her voice was flat. She hated how cold she sounded. "I know Vance prepares for this stuff." Greg took a desperate step forward onto the concrete of the garage. His eyes were wide. "Please, I will pay you. I have cash in the safe. I have gold coins. Name your price." Corinne raised the shotgun. She pumped the slide back and slammed it forward. The heavy metallic clack of chambering a 12-gauge buckshot shell echoed loudly in the freezing air. "Go back to your house, Greg," Corinne said. "Do not take another step toward my family." Greg froze instantly. The hope drained from his face, replaced by total despair and absolute shock. He looked at the barrel of the shotgun, then up at Corinne. He slowly backed away, turning his face toward the dark, freezing street. He walked away into the cold. Corinne lowered the weapon. Her hands shook violently. She forced herself to take a deep breath. Empathy was a luxury they could no longer afford. The old world of neighbors and kindness was dead. She had to become something much harder to keep her children alive. "Get in the car," Vance ordered quietly. He understood the toll that decision had just taken on her. They climbed into the freezing seats. Vance sat behind the wheel. He inserted the old metal key into the ignition. He pumped the gas pedal twice to prime the mechanical carburetor. He turned the key. The starter motor whined loudly. It ground for 3 agonizing seconds. Corinne held her breath. Then the engine caught. It roared to life with a deep, throaty rumble. A thick cloud of white exhaust blew out of the tailpipe into the cold air. The engine vibrated aggressively through the metal floorboards. It was the only sound of a working motor for miles. Vance slammed the heavy gear shift into first. He dropped the clutch. The Jeep lurched forward, rolling down the driveway and out onto the chaotic street. Denver was completely unhinged. Plumes of thick black smoke rose from different neighborhoods where fires burned unchecked. The sky turned a dark, bruised purple as the winter sun sank behind the mountains. The temperature was plummeting fast. Vance navigated the residential side streets. He drove the Jeep over concrete curbs and across snowy front lawns to avoid the tangled mess of dead modern cars blocking the intersections. People stopped in the streets to stare at the passing vehicle. Some waved their arms frantically, begging for a ride. Others, consumed by sudden rage, picked up heavy rocks and threw them at the moving Jeep. A stone bounced hard off the rear fender with a loud metallic clang. Corinne kept her eyes locked straight ahead. She gripped the dashboard with her left hand. The heavy shotgun rested firmly between her knees. "We need to reach Interstate 70, Vance said loudly over the roar of the mechanical engine. "If we can get past the city limits, we take the old logging road straight up into the mountains to your father." "Just keep moving," Corinne said. Declan sat in the back, silent and pale. He watched people fighting over bags of groceries outside a smashed convenience store. Maeve sat right beside him, holding her bear tightly against her chest, her eyes wide but tearless. The Jeep climbed a steep concrete on-ramp leading to the highway. The mud tires spun slightly on a patch of black ice, then caught traction and bit into the asphalt. Vance steered them up the incline. They reached the crest of the ramp. The massive highway stretched out before them. Vance slammed his heavy boot on the brake pedal. The Jeep slid forward a few feet before coming to a complete, violent stop. Corinne stared through the dirty windshield. Her stomach dropped like a stone. Interstate 70 was a massive graveyard. It was a solid, unbroken wall of dead metal. Thousands of cars, trucks, and heavy semi-trailers were packed closely together across all 4 westbound lanes. There was no gap, there was no shoulder. It was a massive, tangled web of vehicles, stretching as far as the eye could see into the dark foothills of the Rocky Mountains. People were abandoning their cars in droves. Hundreds of dark, shivering figures were walking slowly along the asphalt. They carried suitcases, plastic bags, and blankets. They looked like desperate refugees fleeing a war zone, marching blindly into the brutal cold. Vance gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned pure white. He punched the hard plastic dashboard in a sudden burst of pure frustration. "There is no way through," Vance muttered. Not even a dirt bike could fit through that mess. Corinne looked past the sea of dead cars toward the dark, jagged peaks of the mountains rising in the far distance. The wind howled against the thin canvas roof of the old Jeep. The digital thermometer on the dashboard was completely dead, but she knew the temperature was already dropping well below 20 degrees Fahrenheit. The night was going to be lethal. They were over 30 miles away from the fortified bunker. Corinne opened her door. The brutal mountain wind hit her face like a sheet of solid ice. "Grab your bags," Corinne said. "We walk from here." Chapter 3, The Mechanic in the Dark. Declan dragged his heavy leather boots across the frozen asphalt of Interstate 70. The wind cut through his thick winter jacket like broken glass. Walking down the highway felt like walking through a mechanical graveyard. Thousands of dead vehicles sat in frozen, jagged lines. Snow began to fall in heavy, wet clumps. The flakes looked gray in the pale moonlight. Declan adjusted the nylon straps of his canvas survival backpack. It dug violently into his shoulders. The bag weighed 40 pounds. It was packed with freeze-dried meals, water filters, and extra ammunition. His father had made him carry it during practice hikes last summer. Declan hated those hikes. He had complained the entire time. Now, that heavy bag was the only thing keeping him alive. He looked at his hands. They were soft. They were clean. 2 hours ago, his biggest problem was finding a logic error in his Python code. He was a high school senior. He was supposed to study computer science at the state university next fall. His brain held thousands of lines of syntax, complex algorithms, and digital architecture. Now all of his knowledge was absolute garbage. The world had just reset to zero. His skills were completely worthless. He did not know how to start a fire with damp wood. He did not know how to track an animal. He only knew how to type on a keyboard that would never turn on again. Vance walked point. His father moved with a quiet, terrifying efficiency. His hand never left the grip of the Glock 19 hidden under his coat. Corinne walked right behind Vance. She kept Maeve tightly between them. Declan took up the rear. He felt like a massive liability. He was just another mouth to feed in a starving world. The highway narrowed as it approached a dark concrete overpass. A massive commercial transport truck lay jackknifed across all 3 westbound lanes. The heavy trailer had crushed a small blue sedan against the center concrete median. The gap between the twisted wreckage was extremely tight. Vance held up a closed fist. The family stopped immediately. "Stay close," Vance whispered. "Keep your heads down and step exactly where I step." They squeezed through the narrow passage of torn metal. The smell of leaking diesel fuel and engine coolant was thick and nauseating. Declan pressed his back against the cold steel of the truck trailer. He could hear the winter wind howling through the shattered windows of the dead cars. A glass bottle shattered on the pavement directly behind them. 4 men stepped out from the deep shadows of the overpass. They looked young, maybe college students, but their eyes were wild and hollow. Desperation had already taken complete control of their minds. The temperature was dropping fast. They needed coats. They needed food. They were willing to kill for it. "Drop the bags," the lead man ordered. He held a heavy rusted tire iron. The man next to him gripped a long, serrated kitchen knife. Vance stepped in front of his family. He drew his pistol and aimed it at the chest of the lead man. "Walk away," Vance said. His voice was entirely calm and steady. "You do not want to do this. We will defend ourselves." "You cannot shoot all of us before we reach you," the man with the knife snarled. "Give us the bags or we take them off your corpses." The man with the tire iron swung. He did not aim for Vance. He lunged to the side and aimed a brutal strike right at Corinne. Vance threw his body forward to intercept the weapon. He caught the heavy steel blow squarely on his left forearm. The sickening crack of snapping bone echoed loudly in the tight space. Vance grunted in sudden agony. His legs gave out. He dropped to one knee. The pistol slipped from his grip and clattered out of reach under a dead vehicle. The attackers swarmed him instantly. The man with the knife drove his knee hard into Vance's chest, pinning him to the frozen asphalt. Corinne raised the shotgun, but she could not fire. The men were entirely tangled with her husband. If she pulled the trigger, the spread of the buckshot would tear Vance apart. "Help him!" Corinne screamed. Declan stood completely frozen. His legs felt like heavy blocks of lead. The wind roared in his ears. His vision tunneled. His father was getting beaten to death right in front of him. He reached blindly to his belt. His father had forced him to carry a small camping hatchet before they left the house. The handle was wrapped tightly in rough green paracord. Declan pulled it free from the nylon sheath. The forged steel head felt impossibly heavy in his trembling hand. He did not think about the moral consequences. He just moved. Declan rushed forward. The man with the knife raised his arm for a final, fatal downward strike in the gonapads. He did not aim for a specific target. He just swung with every ounce of panic, terror, and adrenaline in his young body. The heavy steel blade bit deep into the attacker's right collarbone. The brutal impact sent a violent shockwave up Declan's arms. It felt absolutely nothing like the movies or video games. It felt like chopping a piece of wet, thick wood. The man screamed. It was a high, wet, agonizing sound that tore through the cold air. Warm blood sprayed across the white side of the truck trailer. It looked completely black in the moonlight. Declan ripped the hatchet backward. The blade pulled free from the bone with a sickening suction noise. The man collapsed onto the asphalt. He dropped the knife and clutched his ruined shoulder. He convulsed on the ground, shrieking in pure agony as his blood poured onto the snow. The other 3 men froze. They stared at the dark blood pooling on the ground. They looked up at Declan. He stood over his father. The bloody hatchet trembled violently in his hands. His chest heaved. His stomach churned. He wanted to vomit. "Run!" Declan screamed. His voice cracked with raw emotion. The 3 remaining men turned and bolted back into the dark shadows of the concrete overpass. They left their bleeding friend to die on the frozen ground. Corinne rushed forward immediately. She grabbed Vance by the shoulders and pulled him up against the truck tires. Vance clutched his left arm tightly against his chest. His face was pure white. The bone was broken cleanly. Declan stared down at the man on the ground. The desperate shrieks were slowly turning into wet, gurgling breaths. The snow around him was melting rapidly from the heat of his blood. Declan fell to his knees. The hatchet dropped from his numb fingers. He had just killed a human being. "Pick up the hatchet, kid," a deep voice commanded from the shadows. Declan jerked his head up. Corinne spun around and leveled the shotgun at the darkness. A man stepped out from behind the massive cab of the jackknife truck. He moved across the snow without making a single sound. He wore stained canvas coveralls, heavy leather work boots, and a thick wool coat. A battered AR-15 rifle hung from a black tactical sling across his chest. He kept his hands resting on the sling, away from the trigger. "Easy there, lady," the man said. He raised his empty hands slowly. "I am not with those stupid kids. I watched the whole thing from the cab of that truck. The kid did exactly what he had to do to save his old man." Vance stepped in front of Corinne. He held his broken arm tight against his ribs. He had kicked his pistol out from under the car and picked it up with his good right hand. He aimed the weapon directly at the stranger's chest. "Who are you?" Vance demanded. His voice was tight with pain. "My name is Briggs Garrison," the man said. He chewed slowly on a wooden toothpick. "I am a mechanic. Was a mechanic, anyway. Had a small auto shop about 2 miles back down the road. Some looters set it on fire an hour ago. Now I am just a guy trying not to freeze to death on this miserable highway." Briggs looked down at the dying man on the ground. Then he looked at Declan. "First time causing a bleeder?" Briggs asked quietly. Declan nodded slowly. He could not find his voice to speak. "It never gets easier," Briggs said, "but it keeps you breathing. Remember that for next time." Briggs looked back at Vance. He noted the high-end tactical bags, the heavy shotgun, and the military-grade boots the family wore. "You people look like you have an actual destination," Briggs said, "but your point man here just caught a bad break. You need to splint and wrap that arm right now. The pain shock will kill him before the cold does. You cannot do medical work out here in this wind." "We are moving," Vance said through gritted teeth. "Not through there," Briggs pointed a gloved finger toward the dark highway ahead. "There is a massive pileup of semi-trucks about a mile down, totally blocked from concrete to concrete, but I know this stretch of land better than anyone. I used to tow wrecks out of here for the state. There is an old dirt maintenance access road that bypasses the main highway lanes. It cuts deep through the trees and drops you right past the old abandoned toll booth station." Vance narrowed his eyes suspiciously. "Why tell us?" "Because I smell beef jerky and high-calorie protein bars inside those fancy bags," Briggs said flatly, "and I have not eaten a thing since yesterday morning. I will guide you to the access road. I will help you set his broken arm. You give me 2 meals and a bottle of clean water. Then we go our separate ways." Corinne looked at Vance. His face was covered in a cold sweat. He was losing strength rapidly. She nodded her head slightly. "Deal," Vance said, "but you walk in front of us. My wife keeps the shotgun pointed at your spine the entire time." Briggs smiled. It was a cold, highly pragmatic smile. "Fair enough." They moved off the main highway. Briggs led them down a steep dirt embankment into the thick, dark pine trees. The brutal wind died down almost immediately, blocked by the dense forest canopy. The snow here was knee-deep and untouched. Declan dragged his heavy feet. His hands were still covered in drying, sticky blood. He could not stop seeing the attacker's face. He could not stop hearing the terrible sound of the hatchet hitting bone. The reality of the new world was crushing him. He looked at his younger sister. Maeve walked quietly in front of him, stepping precisely into the footprints left by their mother. She had seen the entire bloody fight. She had not screamed. She just kept moving forward. The world had changed violently, and she was already adapting to the silence. Declan felt a massive surge of shame. He needed to be much stronger. He needed to protect her. Briggs stopped walking. He held up a hand. "We are here," Briggs whispered. "The toll booth is just past these trees. It should be completely abandoned. The state shut it down 3 years ago." Declan pushed his way through the heavy, snow-covered pine branches. He stepped up onto the cracked asphalt of the old access road. He looked ahead. The cold breath caught violently in his throat. The toll booth was not abandoned. 4 large metal trash barrels burned brightly in the center of the road. The orange firelight cast long, dancing shadows against the concrete walls of the station. Armed men stood in groups around the warm fires. They all wore matching gray uniforms. They were maximum security prison uniforms. But the uniforms were not what made Declan's blood run completely cold. Suspended from the heavy steel canopy of the main toll booth were 3 human bodies. They hung completely upside down by their ankles, swinging gently in the bitter winter wind. Chapter 4. The Warden's Toll. Vance sank his teeth into his lower lip until he tasted copper. The pain in his left arm was a living, breathing creature. It tore at his nerves with every heartbeat. The bone was cleanly snapped. He kept his good right hand gripped tightly around his pistol. He stared through the dark pine branches at the concrete toll booth. The 3 bodies twisted slowly on thick yellow ropes. They were stripped of their winter coats. The firelight from the burning trash barrels cast long, dancing shadows across their frozen faces. Vance quickly counted the men warming their hands by the fires. There were 12 of them. They wore standard-issue gray canvas uniforms. Prison issue, some had heavy winter coats thrown over their shoulders. They carried an assortment of weapons: rusty tire irons, pump-action shotguns, and a few scoped hunting rifles looted from dead vehicles. These were not panicked civilians. These were maximum security inmates. "Back up," Vance whispered. He pushed Corinne gently by the shoulder. We do not cross here. We go back to the highway. Too late for that, friend. The voice came from the right. It was smooth, calm, and carried easily over the crackling fires. A heavy beam of white light cut through the dark trees. It hit Vance squarely in the chest. Corinne instantly raised her shotgun. She aimed directly down the beam of light. Two men stepped out of the brush. They had flanked the family completely unnoticed. They aimed short-barreled rifles at Corinne. "Drop the scattergun, lady," one of the inmates said. He racked the charging handle of his rifle. "Or I will paint the snow with your brains." "Nobody shoots," a new voice commanded from the center of the toll booth area. A man walked slowly out of the concrete command center. He did not wear gray canvas. He wore a crisp, dark blue tactical uniform. A heavy black Kevlar vest covered his chest. A silver badge hung from his tactical belt, catching the orange firelight. He walked with absolute authority. The inmates parted to let him through. They lowered their eyes. They respected him. That terrified Vance more than the guns. "Bring them into the light," the man in blue ordered. The two inmates grabbed Vance by his broken arm. He bit down a scream. The pain dropped him to his knees, but they dragged him forward onto the cracked asphalt of the toll plaza. Corinne, Declan, and Maeve were pushed violently out of the trees behind him. Briggs was gone. The mechanic had melted into the deep shadows the second the flashlight beam hit them. Vance kept his mouth shut about it. The man in blue stopped 5 feet away. He looked down at Vance. His face was clean-shaven, sharp, and totally devoid of empathy. His eyes were cold gray. "My name is Hollis Thorne," the man said. "I was the senior warden at the state penitentiary. 2 hours ago, I was transporting a bus full of violent offenders to a new facility. Then the sky lit up. The bus died. The radio died." Hollis paced slowly around the family. He looked at their expensive hiking boots, their heavy canvas survival bags, and the tactical chest rig Vance wore beneath his coat. "Most guards panicked," Hollis continued. His voice was conversational, like he was discussing the weather. "They tried to run. My prisoners killed them, but I did not run. I understand the new rules of this world better than anyone. Society is dead. Law is a memory. The only currency left is violence and resources." Hollis stopped in front of Corinne. He reached out and tapped the barrel of her shotgun with a gloved finger. Corinne did not flinch. She glared at him with pure hatred. "You people are not refugees," Hollis said. He looked back at Vance. "You are preppers. You have top-tier cold weather gear. You have military-grade trauma kits strapped to your bags. You are moving with absolute purpose. You have a destination." Vance pushed himself up from the asphalt. He stood on shaky legs. He cradled his broken arm against his chest. "We are just heading to a cabin," Vance lied. His voice was rough. "It is empty. We have nothing you need." Hollis smiled. It was a terrifying, hollow expression. "Do not insult my intelligence, friend," Hollis said. "A man does not buy a chest rig to carry a few granola bars. You are carrying laminated topographical maps in your left pouch. I can see the green edge of the waterproof paper. You are heading to a bunker. A fully stocked, off-grid hole in the ground." Hollis drew a heavy .45 caliber pistol from his hip holster. He did not point it at Vance. He pointed it directly at the space between Maeve and Corinne. Declan shifted his weight, his hands clenching into fists. The dried blood on his fingers cracked in the cold air. "Do not move, kid," an inmate warned, pressing a rifle barrel into Declan's back. "Here is the situation," Hollis said smoothly. "My men are cold. They are hungry. We need a permanent shelter before the real winter storms hit. You are going to give me that map. You are going to tell me exactly how to bypass the security doors of your little bunker." "I will die first," Vance said. "No," Hollis replied softly. "You will not die. I will shoot your wife in the stomach. Then I will let my men take your teenage boy into the woods. I will let you listen to him scream while you bleed on the concrete. Then, when you are thoroughly broken, you will give me the map." Vance felt the cold reality of the threat. Hollis was not bluffing. He was a master of psychological torture. He had spent his entire career breaking violent men. He knew exactly how to dismantle a father. Corinne met Vance's eyes. She gave him a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head. She was telling him not to surrender. She was ready to die on her feet. Vance calculated the odds. 12 armed men. 1 broken arm, 1 shotgun. They were entirely outgunned. They needed a miracle. The miracle came in the form of a massive fireball. 50 yards away, deep in the tangled mess of dead cars on the old highway access ramp, A deafening explosion shattered the quiet night. A massive column of bright orange flame erupted into the dark sky. The shock wave rolled over the toll plaza. It rattled the concrete pillars and threw burning debris across the snow. A heavy steel car door spun through the air and smashed into the roof of the toll booth with a horrific metallic crash. Briggs had found an abandoned propane tank inside a stalled recreational vehicle. He had cracked the valve, walked away, and fired a single rifle round into the metal cylinder. The inmates panicked instantly. They threw their arms over their faces and ducked for cover. Some fired their weapons blindly into the dark trees. The discipline Hollis had forced upon them vanished in a single second of absolute chaos. Hollis flinched, his head whipping toward the explosion. His pistol dipped away from Corinne. Vance did not hesitate. "Run," Vance screamed. Corinne dropped her shoulder and rammed her heavy frame directly into the chest of the inmate standing next to her. The man stumbled backward, slipping on a patch of black ice. He hit the ground hard. Corinne pumped the shotgun and fired a 12-gauge shell into the air, deafening the men around her and creating a wall of smoke and panic. Declan grabbed Maeve by the strap of her purple backpack. He yanked her forward. They sprinted wildly past the burning trash barrels. Vance followed them. He ignored the blinding pain in his arm. He ducked under a wild swing from a prisoner with a baseball bat. He kicked the man in the knee, heard a satisfying pop, and kept moving. They hit the tree line at a full sprint. The deep snow swallowed their boots. The branches whipped violently against their faces. They plunged into the absolute darkness of the dense pine forest. They ran blindly, putting as much distance between themselves and the toll plaza as their burning lungs would allow. Back at the concrete station, the flames from the exploded vehicle cast an eerie, flickering light over the chaos. Hollis Thorne did not shout. He did not curse. He calmly holstered his heavy pistol. He wiped a few flakes of ash from his dark blue tactical jacket. He looked at the frantic inmates scrambling to put out the small fires spreading near their supplies. He turned his cold gray eyes toward the dark forest where the family had disappeared. Hollis slowly smiled. The hunt was always the best part. "Settle down," Hollis commanded. His voice cut through the noise like a razor blade. The inmates instantly stopped moving. Hollis walked over to a heavy metal transport crate resting near the command center. He kicked the heavy latch open. "Bring out the hounds," Hollis ordered. "Get the halogen spotlights. They have a man with a broken arm and a little girl. They are leaving a trail of blood and heavy footprints in the fresh snow. We are going hunting." The deep, aggressive barking of 4 trained attack dogs echoed into the freezing mountain air. Chapter 5. The Ascent. Corinne forced her heavy boots through the waist-deep powder. Her lungs burned with every breath. The incline of the mountain face was nearly vertical. Every single step required massive physical effort. She grabbed a thick pine branch and pulled her body upward. The frozen wood snapped instantly. She slipped backward. She slid 3 feet down the icy slope before catching herself on a jagged rock. She bit her tongue hard. The warm metallic taste of blood filled her mouth. The wind howled aggressively through the dark trees. A massive winter storm had moved in over the Rockies. Snow fell in thick, blinding sheets. It was not just cold. It was a lethal, freezing assault. The temperature had plummeted to 10 degrees below zero. The wind chill pushed it even lower. She looked back down the trail. Declan was carrying Maeve on his back. The teenage boy was trembling violently under the weight. His face was entirely gray. He was exhausted, pushing past the absolute limits of his physical endurance. Ahead of them, Briggs carved a brutal path through the snow. The lone mechanic moved with a steady mechanical efficiency. He used his rifle barrel to push heavy, snow-laden branches aside. He did not speak. He just kept climbing. Vance dragged himself directly behind Briggs. He was dying slowly. Corinne could see it clearly in his rigid posture. His broken arm was bound tight against his chest with medical tape and a primitive splint made from a tree branch. The shock of the shattered bone was taking a massive toll on his nervous system. He stumbled forward. Briggs caught him by the heavy collar of his winter coat and hauled him upright. "Keep moving," Briggs ordered over the roaring wind. "If we stop out here, we freeze solid in 10 minutes. Corinne reached Declan. She grabbed Maeve. The young girl felt incredibly heavy. Corinne pulled her daughter into her own arms. Maeve was not shivering anymore. That was the most terrifying medical sign. When the human body temperature drops too low, the muscles stop spasming to generate heat. The core begins to shut down. Maeve had dark blue lips. Her eyes were half open and completely glassy. She was suffering from severe hypothermia. "She is fading," Corinne shouted over the wind. Pure panic clawed at her throat. She forced it down immediately. She had to act like a field medic right now, not a mother. "There is an overhang," Briggs yelled back. He pointed up the steep grade. "Right under that massive granite ridge. It will block the wind." They scrambled desperately up the last 50 yards of the incline. The granite overhang formed a shallow, natural cave. It was dry underneath the rock ceiling. The brutal wind rushed past the opening, howling into the dark night. Corinne laid Maeve down on the hard dirt floor. She ripped her own heavy winter coat open. She tore off her insulated gloves. "Declan, get the thermal blankets out of my pack," Corinne ordered. Her hands shook violently as she unzipped Maeve's jacket. The girl's inner layers were damp with sweat and melted snow. Wet clothes conducted heat away from the body 25 times faster than dry air. Corinne had to get them off immediately. She stripped her daughter down to her thin base layers. Declan handed her a folded square of silver mylar. Corinne shook it open. The metallic survival blanket crinkled loudly in the small cave. "Vance, sit down right here," Corinne commanded. She pushed her husband against the cold rock wall. "Open your coat, unbutton your shirt, hold her directly against your chest. Skin-to-skin contact is the only way we can warm her core temperature now." Vance did not argue. He unzipped his jacket and tore open his thermal shirt. He winced in pure agony as his broken arm shifted against his ribs. Corinne placed Maeve directly against his bare chest. She wrapped the silver mylar blanket tightly around both of them, trapping the radiant body heat. She piled 2 heavy canvas sleeping bags over the top of the silver material. "Talk to her," Corinne said. She checked Maeve's pulse at the neck. It was dangerously faint and thready. "Do not let her fall asleep, Vance. Keep her brain active." Vance leaned his head down. He rested his chin on the top of his daughter's head. "I am right here, sweetie. You are doing great. We are almost to Grandpa Silas. He has a warm fire waiting for us. He has hot soup." Corinne sat back on her heels. She wiped the cold sweat from her forehead. The thermal transfer was their only option. There was no fire. Building a fire would instantly give away their position to the men hunting them. A new sound cut through the howling wind. It was distant, but entirely clear. A deep, aggressive bark. Corinne froze. She looked at Briggs. The mechanic was already moving toward the dark mouth of the cave. He dropped to one knee and raised his rifle. He stared down the snowy slope they had just climbed. "Hounds," Briggs stated flatly. "4 of them. Maybe half a mile down the mountain. They have our scent. The fresh snow is too deep to hide our tracks." Vance shifted his weight under the heavy sleeping bags. "How long do we have?" 20 minutes, Briggs said. "Maybe 15. Those dogs are bred specifically for mountain terrain. The men behind them have high-powered halogen lamps. I can see the beams sweeping through the pine trees down below." Corinne looked down at Maeve. A very faint flush of pink was returning to her pale cheeks. She took a deep, shuddering breath. The body heat transfer was slowly working, but she desperately needed more time. Moving the girl right now would trigger cardiac arrest. "We need to buy time," Corinne said. She looked directly at her husband. Vance carefully slid out from under the heavy blankets. He tucked the sleeping bag tightly around Maeve. He stood up slowly. He looked incredibly pale, but his eyes were entirely focused. He reached into his tactical canvas bag with his good right hand. He pulled out a spool of heavy green paracord and 2 12-gauge shotgun shells. "Briggs," Vance said, "do you have any nails or loose metal in your pockets?" The mechanic dug into his thick canvas coveralls. He pulled out a handful of heavy steel lug nuts, brass washers, and long wood screws. He handed the cold metal to Vance. "We are going to make a mess," Vance said. They walked out into the freezing blizzard. Corinne watched them disappear into the whiteout conditions. She turned back to the cave. She picked up her pump-action shotgun. She racked a heavy shell into the chamber. The metallic clack echoed off the stone walls. She knelt right beside her children. She aimed the black steel barrel toward the dark opening of the cave. Down the steep slope, Vance and Briggs worked rapidly in the freezing dark. Vance found a narrow choke point between 2 massive pine trees. It was the only logical path up the steep ridge toward the cave. He tied one end of the green paracord to an exposed tree root. He stretched the strong line across the snowy path, pulling it tight exactly 6 inches above the ground. He secured the other end to the trunk of the second pine tree. "Give me the shells," Briggs said. He pulled a heavy survival knife from his tactical belt. Vance handed him the red plastic shotgun shells. Briggs carefully sliced the thick plastic open with the sharp blade. He poured the black gunpowder into a small, hollowed-out piece of dead wood. He packed the heavy steel lug nuts, and brass washers tightly on top of the powder. He rigged a crude friction striker using a sharp piece of flint and the rough edge of a metal zipper from his coat pocket. He tied the tripwire directly to the striker mechanism. "It is primitive," Briggs whispered, "but it will blow their legs clean off if they hit that wire." "Set another one," Vance ordered, 30 yards further down the trail. They moved as fast as the deep snow allowed. The howling wind masked their noise, but it also masked the approach of the hunters. The barking grew significantly louder. The dogs were closing the distance rapidly. Brilliant beams of intense white light pierced the falling snow, casting long, terrifying shadows through the dense forest. Vance finished tying the second tripwire. His fingers were completely numb. He could not feel the cord anymore. He dropped his hands to his sides. "Back to the cave," Vance said. They turned and scrambled up the icy rocks. They slid back under the granite overhang just as the wind picked up again. Corinne lowered her weapon slightly when they entered. "They are right below us," Briggs said. He chambered a round in his rifle. "They have to cross the choke point to reach this ridge." The family sat in total silence. The blizzard screamed outside. Maeve finally let out a small, weak cough. Corinne squeezed her cold hand tightly. The barking was absolutely deafening now. The hounds were highly aggressive, pulling hard on their heavy leather leashes. The crunch of boots on the frozen snow echoed up the side of the mountain. A brilliant beam of white light swept across the rock ceiling of the ice cave. Corinne tightened her grip on the shotgun. Her heart hammered violently against her ribs. She stopped breathing. Then, the mountain erupted. A massive boom shook the solid ground. The crude explosive device detonated with brutal, destructive force. A bright flash of orange fire illuminated the snow outside the cave. The distinct sound of jagged metal shrapnel tearing through wood and flesh followed immediately. A man screamed in absolute agony. The terrible, wet sound echoed into the dark night. The dogs instantly stopped barking. The heavy woods fell dead silent, save for the howling wind and the agonizing moans of the wounded man bleeding in the snow. Vance leaned against the cave wall. He drew his pistol with his right hand. A single gunshot rang out from the darkness below. It was not aimed at the cave. It was fired straight up into the air. The moaning stopped immediately. Hollis Thorne had just executed his own wounded man. He had zero tolerance for dead weight slowing down his hunt. The smooth, chilling voice of Hollis drifted up the mountain. It cut clearly through the raging blizzard. "You are out of room to run, Sterling." Vance looked at Corinne. He looked down at the GPS device strapped to his wrist. The digital screen was entirely dead, but he knew the coordinates by heart. The reinforced steel door of Silas Sterling's bunker was less than 300 yards away, buried somewhere under the thick ice at the very top of the ridge. Chapter 6. The Iron Door. Vance pushed his heavy boots through the deep snow drifts. The summit of the ridge was flat and wide. It was covered in ancient pine trees and massive granite boulders. The wind screamed across the exposed rock face. According to his memory of the topographical map, they were standing directly on top of the bunker coordinates. But there was absolutely nothing here. Just trees, rocks, and the howling whiteout of the blizzard. He dropped to his knees. He ignored the screaming pain in his broken arm. He used his good right hand to sweep away a thick layer of snow. He expected to feel cold steel. He only felt frozen dirt and dead pine needles. "Where is it?" Corinne shouted over the roaring wind. "It should be right here," Vance replied frantically. He dug harder into the frozen earth. His fingernails cracked against a buried rock. Panic began to rise in his chest. A cold, heavy knot formed in his stomach. He had brought his family all this way to freeze to death on a barren peak. Briggs dropped to a prone position behind a fallen tree trunk. The mechanic aimed his rifle back down the steep trail they had just climbed. "We are out of time," Briggs yelled. 3 bright beams of halogen light pierced the falling snow from the lower ridge. The beams swept rapidly across the dark trees. One of the intense lights hit Corinne squarely in the chest. A rifle cracked loudly from the darkness below. The bullet struck the granite boulder inches from Corinne. Rock fragments exploded outward, raining down on her heavy canvas hood. She threw herself flat against the snow, dragging Maeve down with her. "Contact!" Briggs shouted. He squeezed the trigger of his rifle twice. The loud pops echoed thinly in the freezing air. Vance drew his pistol. He crawled behind a thick pine trunk. He aimed down the steep slope. The shadows were moving fast between the trees. Hollis had driven his men hard up the mountain. They were swarming the ridge, closing the distance with terrifying speed. Bullets tore through the forest. the air filled with the sharp, cracking sounds of supersonic lead breaking the sound barrier. Pine bark shattered into flying splinters. Briggs grunted heavily. His body jerked backward. He rolled onto his side in the deep snow. Vance looked over. The mechanic was clutching his left shoulder. Dark blood poured rapidly between his fingers, staining his canvas coveralls almost completely black in the pale moonlight. "I am hit," Briggs ground out through clenched teeth. He struggled to lift his rifle with his good arm. Vance fired 3 rounds down the hill. He did not aim at a specific target. He just needed to keep their heads down. He pressed the magazine release button on his pistol. The empty metal magazine fell into the snow. He grabbed his final magazine from his belt and slammed it into the grip. He racked the slide. He had exactly 15 rounds of 9mm ammunition left. The men coming up the hill had shotguns and assault rifles. They had the high ground, but they were entirely outgunned. Vance leaned his head back against the rough pine bark. He looked at Corinne. She was shielding Maeve with her own body. He had failed them. Declan lay flat on his stomach 10 feet away. He held the thick silver thermal blankets tightly around his sister. The little girl was completely still. Her breathing was dangerously shallow. Declan watched his father. Vance was completely pinned down behind the tree. Briggs was bleeding out into the snow. The volume of incoming fire was overwhelming. Declan pressed his face into the freezing dirt. He closed his eyes tightly. The fear was absolute. It crushed his chest like a physical weight. He remembered the heavy strike of his hatchet hitting bone on the highway. He did not want to die up here. Then, the ground beneath his stomach began to vibrate. It was a deep, rhythmic thud. It felt like a massive diesel engine turning over deep inside the earth. The vibrations rattled his teeth. Declan opened his eyes. Directly in front of him, a massive mound of snow and dead brush began to rise upward. The base of a massive, dead oak tree shifted unnaturally. It split apart right down the middle. It was not a real tree. It was a hollow shell made of painted fiberglass and thick steel plating. A heavy hydraulic hiss cut clearly through the sound of the gunfire. A camouflaged steel hatch swung open heavily, locking into place with a loud mechanical clank. Warm, bright yellow light spilled out from the hole in the ground. A man stood waist-deep in the open hatch. He was old, with a thick gray beard and a face lined with deep, harsh wrinkles. He wore a faded olive-green military jacket. He wore heavy leather gloves. It was Silas Sterling. Silas did not look surprised to see them. He looked furious. He gripped the twin spade grips of a heavy machine gun mounted on a heavy steel pintle swivel. It was a belt-fed military weapon. A long belt of thick brass ammunition hung from the feed tray, disappearing down into the brightly lit bunker below. Silas pulled the heavy charging handle back. He locked his eyes on the tree line where the flashlights were moving rapidly toward his family. He pressed the heavy butterfly trigger. The noise was completely apocalyptic. The heavy weapon roared, spitting a massive cone of bright orange flame into the blizzard. Heavy caliber tracer rounds tore into the forest like a swarm of angry, burning hornets. The sheer volume of automatic fire was deafening. Declan watched massive pine branches snap and fall. The heavy bullets punched straight through the tree trunks where the inmates were hiding. The rounds shattered the rocks into powder. Screams of pure terror and agonizing pain echoed up the mountain. The flashlights dropped to the snow, pointing wildly in random directions as the men scrambled desperately to escape the brutal barrage of lead. Silas released the trigger. The heavy gun smoked heavily in the freezing air. The sharp, acrid smell of burnt cordite rolled over the ridge, masking the scent of pine and blood. "Get down here," Silas roared. His voice was like grinding gravel. Now, Vance grabbed Briggs by the collar of his coat. He used every ounce of remaining strength in his legs to drag the bleeding mechanic toward the open hatch. Corinne grabbed Declan by the shoulder, pulling him to his feet. Declan reached down and picked up Maeve. He carried her tightly against his chest and ran toward the glowing yellow light. He reached the hatch. Steep concrete stairs descended deep into the earth. Declan climbed down as fast as his frozen legs allowed. The air instantly shifted from freezing cold to incredibly warm. Corinne followed right behind him, keeping her shotgun aimed at the opening. Vance shoved Briggs down the stairwell. The mechanic groaned in pain, clutching his bleeding shoulder as he stumbled down the steps. Silas grabbed the heavy machine gun, detached it rapidly from the swivel mount, and dragged the heavy steel weapon inside the hatch. Vance climbed down last. Silas hit a heavy red button mounted on the thick concrete wall. The massive steel hatch groaned above them. The thick hydraulic pistons engaged with a loud hiss. The heavy iron door slammed shut with a deafening metallic boom. A heavy steel locking wheel turned automatically in the ceiling, sealing them completely from the hellish world outside. The roaring sound of the blizzard vanished instantly. The sounds of gunfire and screaming dogs were entirely cut off. Declan stood at the bottom of the long staircase. The air down here was warm and totally dry. The low, steady hum of a heavy diesel generator vibrated gently through the concrete floor. The walls were lined with heavy metal shelves packed tightly with thousands of canned goods, medical trauma kits, and large blue water barrels. It was a true fortress. It was salvation. Corinne gently laid Maeve onto a nearby canvas military cot. She immediately unzipped her medical bag and began checking her daughter's pulse and core temperature. Briggs slumped heavily against the concrete wall, sliding down to the floor. He pressed a dirty rag hard against his bleeding shoulder, breathing in short, ragged gasps. Vance stood at the bottom of the stairs. He looked completely destroyed. His face was gray with pain. He leaned his back against the cold wall and closed his eyes. "You took your time getting here, boy," Silas said. The old man walked over to a metal table and wiped a smear of black gun oil from his wrinkled forehead with the back of his hand. "We ran into a little trouble on the highway," Vance said quietly. He kept his eyes closed. "A prison warden named Hollis. He runs a militia of inmates. They have guns. They have dogs. They want this bunker. They will definitely be back." Silas walked over to a heavy steel workbench in the far corner of the room. He picked up a clean rag and began wiping down the hot barrel of his machine gun. He did not look panicked. He looked deadly serious. "Hollis will be back with much bigger weapons," Silas said. His voice was low and grim. "He will bring explosives. He will try to smoke us out of this hole. But that is not the biggest problem we have right now." Vance opened his eyes. He stared at his father. What could possibly be worse than an army of armed inmates sitting at our front door? Silas pointed a calloused finger toward a large bank of electronic monitors mounted on the far wall. The flat screens were glowing bright green. They were displaying complex topographical maps and rapidly moving radar signatures. The bunker was buried deep enough and shielded heavily enough to survive the electromagnetic pulse entirely intact. "Go look at the radar, Vance," Silas said quietly. He threw the dirty rag onto the metal workbench. "It is not just the power grid failing. The solar flare knocked out the orbital stabilizers on the satellites." Silas looked directly into Vance's eyes. His expression was cold and completely terrified. "There is something massive falling from orbit, and it is heading straight for the mountains."